Welcome, data enthusiasts. We are Zuma, the recruitment agency focused 100% on data tech professionals in the Berlin region. And this is our podcast, Data for Good, connecting you with all things data. And today I'm joined by César Escobedo. He is Head of Product Platform Analytics at GFK. He has a background in leadership across a number of big names in Berlin and overseas. And that's leadership in product analytics and data engineering. And he's currently with the world's leading consumer intelligence consultancy, headquartered in Nuremberg, international employee base. César, how's it going today?
Yeah, it's going well, actually. Thank you for having me. And happy to be here to share a little bit of my experience with the audience, and hopefully that will resonate with some of you. And in any case, I'll be open as well to connect whenever anyone is interested in going deeper into these topics. So thank you again. And looking forward to our conversation.
You've just opened the floodgates to questions from many people, but that's great. It's great. As a data community member, I'm sure that'll be appreciated. So many thanks. And today's topic, positioning analytics as a decision-making discipline within product. So analytics within product, critical decision-making discipline. Give me the context. What are you trying to achieve by making it a decision-making discipline?
Yeah, it's quite a lot actually to break down. However, let's start with a quite brief understanding as to what we mean by establishing as a discipline. First of all, this is purely based on my experience, right? This past few years, working as a specialist as well as a leader in a number of different organizations that always face the challenge of dealing with data, whether this was culturally, the data maturity aspect of the organization, and most importantly, how prepared an organization is to use or in using actually the data they have collected and how to make sense of it for improving their decision making. So what I would like to actually just to start with is to give you that general understanding of a framework that has worked well for me in the past and that really fits into the scope of establishing product and specifically data as a product or as a discipline within the product development practice. And essentially that framework really comes down to three key components that can help organizations be prepared for embracing data, a data culture, and most importantly, how to really make use of that data in order to make the most of the decisions they make and essentially improve their business, right? And those three components really fit within the scope of strategic alignment. So how prepares the organization skills-wise, but also how aligned is the strategy that you want to bring from the data you have in alignment with your business and operational goals. And also how well are you equipped with the skills that will enable you to make decisions and be able to lead those decisions based on the evidence that you are gaining. The other two components are areas that most people will be familiar with, and this really tap onto the infrastructure, so the data enablement that it's required in order for you to really make use and structure, organize the data for specific purpose. And the last component is what many teams nowadays really focus on, this data-driven, evidence-driven type of decision-making that taps onto the relationships that you build with the teams you partner up with, right? So in essence, this framework, and just to describe the three components, really sit within the strategic alignment for data use, the data enablement component that really sits within the infrastructure and all really technical aspects of data that will power your use of it. And finally, the data operationalization, which is how do you really bring that data to become an actionable component of your decision making. And that really takes the form of that collaborative effort between data teams and the teams they partner up with, right? So
okay,
back to your question and briefly mentioning how do you establish that as a discipline is really by conceiving this framework as a tool that can be really applied in your organization to define how well your data aligns with your objectives as a business. If you have the infrastructure to really be able to collect, process, and make use of that data. So if you have the technical aspects of it, and then how you apply that data more operationally so that your teams can really benefit from the partnerships that they establish with the data teams. So hopefully that gives you a big picture.
That's a lot
that
of
we can.
Yeah, big picture, a lot of information. Let's, throughout this conversation, let's break that
Definitely.
down. So we'll be talking about the framework. We're going to talk about the 3 pillars, talk about business and strategic alignment, how businesses can make themselves prepared, as well as data teams, the infrastructure involved, and how we get to that operationalizational state. Whew. Okay, so practical terms, César, for all the product analysts and leaders out there, what does your vision look like? What's the best case scenario that we're talking about?
So if we really look at this from the perspective of an organization that is eager to use data to improve their business through the improvement of their decisions over time, then definitely the end goal is really to have the right architecture that really fits that specific goal. So in essence, a vision that really taps onto these 3 elements that I just described really will have a strategic alignment with the leadership team that really sees data as a strategic component of their overall success as a business. The second piece will be that there will be investment and specifically technical investment in expanding the infrastructure needed in order to be able to utilize that data. And finally, the people component, right? So that you really want to not just invest in architecture and be a strategic part of the overall success of the business, but that you really want to hire the right talent that can help you bridge and make that specific data accessible for decision making to the people that you will be working with. So overall, when it comes down to product, what you really want to make sure is that all these 3 pieces come together so that essentially whatever new product you are developing, whether this is a feature or an overall set of solutions, that there is always a lens that looks at your success in a measurable, accessible, but also actionable way. And that can be done if there is willingness, but also a strong strategic vision for using data for that specific purpose.
Super. So having the right data, and that is to say the data that fits the company's goal, having investment, I should imagine financial investment, as well as the kind of interest and buy-in, that's the word I was looking for, and also the right people to do the job. Okay.
Correct.
And if we have these working in tandem, working in synergy together, what benefits can the business see? What great outcomes can the business see from the alignment of those 3 areas?
Many. So for starters, one of the key areas would be that there are shared goals or common goals that teams, either operationally, meaning the partnerships that you establish cross-functionally, as well as top-down, basically leadership and operations, can be aligned to serve those specific common goals. So it means that there will be no derailment or less attention on areas that perhaps are more ad hoc and less planned over time. So that's a first benefit. The other one is that it's a lot more effective because you are really serving the needs of the business through the lens of what can be measured and how frequently, and most importantly, what can you action or what set of actions or decisions you can take from that partnership established between data teams and product, right? So one of the key aspects, just to mention an example here, is always data collection and data processing. And that becomes in organizations that are not prepared or that don't see data as a strategic part of their overall success, it usually takes the form of very ad hoc work. So you have many analysts doing a lot of different things that do not really fit together, but they do meet immediate demands, but doesn't necessarily translate into something that is more long-term and that is actually building gradually on top of past work, right? So that's one aspect of it. And the other one is that you don't really build an architecture data-wise that ensures that you can actually measure something historically. So over time to really assess how well your business is performing, right? And more specifically, when it comes to data collection in product, the difficulty is always that we get overexcited about new information coming in that perhaps addresses differently a problem that customers have. And usually that falls short when you don't really have the data to back it up, right? You don't know exactly how that feature is performing because there is no data, new data needs to come in, and then it has to mature until you can really make sense of it. So having this framework in place, right, does help because it gives perspective to future PMs to understand that there is a time for collecting data, for processing it, and finally making it valid for what you are exploring further. And if you have that key component with the leadership and the teams that are running operationally these data processes, then it becomes a more fruitful relationship because the outcome-based vision that the organization might have can be fulfilled because you are clear on the timelines, but also on how you get to measure that success over time. And of course, this could shift, but it will shift within the scope of that alignment between teams. So overall, it's a powerful story and it's quite effective because ultimately you are putting the attention where it needs to be.
I see much more than the outcome of successful data here. You talked about partnerships, leadership, and operations being aligned. If we could get that alignment, and if it's through the efforts and work of analytics, that's a great sign for the business overall. And another benefit would be the effectiveness of data teams and product working together. That has other impacts, cultural as well as commercial. And then the architecture, to me, that also looks like a long-term future utopia, having the right data architecture in place to not only meet the requirements and measurements of today's needs, but also future needs, not just having those short-term wins or short-term goals with short-term wins that the business can be happy about long-term. Okay, talk to me about the framework, what it looks like, and also the strategy of analytics that allows this discipline to exist.
Correct. So let me just go back to your first question as to how we define data as a discipline within this context of product development, and then I'll expand a little bit more on the framework. So one piece that I forgot to mention here is that the reason why we're calling it a discipline is because ultimately data and data analytics should be part of the skill set of anyone in an organization. And the more natural it feels to people, the more it becomes a discipline on itself, right? So it's taking into account problem solving, or just the fact that you might have some good basis for doing your own analysis. But with analytics, this means that you are understanding how data is really being processed for your needs, right? So that you, for instance, as a PM, can be mindful and can be also quite open to the fact that maybe data takes time to collect, that maybe you cannot measure everything if you don't really have a strong baseline for comparison. Or perhaps you are a little bit more mindful as to how you want to run experiments, knowing that you have really understood that ultimately it comes down to the predictions you make through your hypothesis. So there is a component of data maturity and data literacy, but ultimately a discipline really means having it as part of your day-to-day work and that it feels natural. And in that sense, the partnership that you establish with data teams should also feel natural, should not be forced, or it should not be an asymmetric relationship in which you are asking analysts to do things for you, but rather that you work in tandem. So back to your question as to how this framework really looks like, right? I wouldn't say it's a pyramid, but rather it's part of, as you put it, 3 pillars, right? That need to be fully in alignment. And this means that if you have this strategic alignment for the use of your data with the leadership, right? So if you really are seeking a way to meet their goals, both business and or operational goals through data, then definitely that gives you a lot more room for the next 2 pieces, which really focus on the elements, technical elements that you need. So the architecture, the infrastructure, the pipelines, and then the people elements that will come next in the form of the data operationalization, right? So basically, if you want to look at it, I would say what really comes on top is getting that alignment with the leadership teams as to how data is strategic for the organization's success. And then once you have that buy-in and support and really can tell the story as a leader as to why data really serves the success of the business and its operations, then the next thing is to really start looking for how to establish that data enablement piece that informs you of the technical elements required for building that data infrastructure that informs you later on your needs, whether this is on reporting, experimentation, or further analysis, and then the human or people component that really sits within data operationalization. And here, to your question on partnerships, really what matters is the context that you gain from the relationship you build with the teams you work with. And here it's a lot about how you work with these teams, let's say a product team and a data team, to really frame the context of their work. And that's a very important part of this overall framework, is that ultimately data in isolation is not helpful. It has to be contextualized, but the only contextualization happens through the relationship that you have on a day-to-day basis with the teams you operate with. And of course, that contextualization needs to be part of an overall strategic alignment. Otherwise, it's completely out of scope, right? And one important piece of that relationship you build with teams, it's really the aspect of building together, as I said, share goals, common goals, but most important, building together a decision architecture. What kind of decisions do we want to take out of this relationship, right? How do we look at decisions, right? In the data enablement piece, you have the definition of done, right? When you look at data architecture, when are we done? When do we move on to the next big piece when it comes to, let's say, data processing, right? However, when it comes to that relationship between teams, is really having that architecture in place for decision making. And that really means an agreement on the processes that we want to establish and the standards and the way we want to define and understand overall the work we're doing. And just to give you a tiny example before we go to your next question, many times over, I hear people talking about definitions like what is it our business does, right? Or what this feature means. And the lack of operational definitions, so basically common understanding between teams as to what it means, could actually be a big disadvantage, because sometimes we give a marketing pitch as to what we mean. Let's say I want to measure success, right? But if you don't know what success translates back into data, then it's going to be very difficult to measure it. So it's great to have this, high-level pitch as to what we mean of a specific area, but it's more important to define operationally how tangible it becomes in the data, but also how useful and actionable it is for product teams.
Interesting.
So I hope that gives you a little bit more perspective as to how this framework works.
It certainly does. And I also make an observation. Many of the conversations we've been having over the last 2 years have been about getting buy-in, data, building a data culture. It's great that we're now starting to talk about maturity and literacy, getting operational stakeholders educated in data for self-service or self-enablement. And that also helps with our vision of creating the best possible discipline for decision making within product via analytics. Okay.
Maybe just to add briefly,
please.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just to briefly add here, because something that comes to mind is really something I heard actually from the community, the data community, quite often. It's not really about the data that you have, right? Everybody wants to be data driven, use the data that might be in Excels, in databases, and so forth in your organization. It's more how that data is used by your stakeholders or by your internal teams. And that's more important, because that should be the starting point of your reflection as to how data maturity plays out in your organization. Because it's not about the investment that you could have in that data infrastructure, because you could have tons of data scattered around. You might collect a lot of information, the best engineering teams running your data centers. The question is more, is it used at all, and how is it used? And if you start discovering that,
and how beneficial is it? Like, how much return on investment, direct or indirect, can we get from this? Because ultimately, the business is going to be making their decision to invest or not based on its effectiveness.
Correct.
Decision architecture you mentioned, and decision intelligence. Tell me how this factors in, because it's going to be a critical point for those leadership stakeholders, certainly.
Definitely. I mean, if I may just briefly define what I understand by decision intelligence, it's really taking decision making from the individual to the organization, right? So it's organizational level decision making. And for that, you need a set of criteria that you establish with common goals in mind. And of course, when we look at it individually, everybody gets very excited. I make the best decisions, I process data, but that's not the purpose here. The purpose is to look at it from an organizational standpoint. And when you start conceiving it this way, the role of leadership, especially to make data salient and strategic, and most importantly, connected, not just to the return on investment as you pointed, but really as to how this becomes key to the success of the business, right? It takes center stage. And that's what is important. It's to look at it as an organization, and how do we really want to take it, not just to the next level, but to be part of our everyday work life.
Is there I don't imagine there is, but is there an easy template or structure or criteria that you see for data architecture if you are encouraging other data leaders to get in on this and to get buy-in from their executive or business leadership? Is there a criteria that you see?
This really depends on the context, and most importantly, the sector you are in, right, as a business. However, some advice I could share from my own experience, especially having seen and having been part of establishing a data culture within many organizations, is that usually the biggest mistake one makes is to focus on the technical aspect of the work, when in reality, what matters is to come up with a story that really centers on how well you can align your thoughts around data to the strategy the company has overall of using that data, right? Because as I said a few times already, many organizations praise themselves of using data for everyday decision making, when in reality, when you go back and look at what they are actually doing, it's very simple analysis through Excel. And that's fine if you're an organization that wants to grow, but this cannot be done at scale. Exactly. So when I talk about building that architecture for decision making at an organizational level, it means that you are already taking scalability as part of that desired value to really make decision making at a much larger scale and with a larger horizon than what you're doing today. And my advice would be, yes, data enablement, which is one of the components of the framework I'm presenting today, it's relevant. So the technical aspect of it is very important. You need good engineering. But if you only focus on this when you go to talk to leadership teams, you will actually be presented with many challenges, because one of those challenges could be return on investment, right? And it's very difficult for an intangible part of the business, which is, you know, your data centers, your data architecture, to translate back to return on investment for a leader who might not actually understand fully the scope of your work, which is essential. However, it becomes very fastly very vague when you try to narrow it down to as to what it means for the business, right? And here's why you need that strategic alignment. Yes, you need that investment in your infrastructure, but most importantly, you really need to contextualize those two by building the partnership with the teams that you collaborate with. And that's, I would say it's a cycle, right? Ultimately, you are feeding back that information you're getting from the context you gain in those relationship or that collaborative effort, and then bringing it back to become a strategic part of it while expanding you know, the data that you're capturing, how you organize it, and so forth. So that would be one key advice. Don't focus so much on the technical aspect of it if you haven't really conceived how this plays out overall for the success of the business.
Okay, yeah, and scalability, building something for scalability, but I also see that as being future-proof, or at least guiding us towards the future. Data enablement, you've mentioned that a couple of times. Can you clearly define the most important areas within data enablement?
Yes, definitely. So there are three that I've I gained throughout my experience working with data engineering, and also from the perspective of the data analyst working alongside data engineers to build this kind of infrastructure. So there are three areas that I believe are critical here. The first one is the simplest one, right, that we talked about. I mean, it's complex in the amount of work, but simple to define because it's the most tangible and visible to everyone, and possibly more familiar to the audience that is listening to us today. And that has to do with infrastructure. And by infrastructure, we're talking about the databases, data management tools, pipelines, the architecture, the way you build the data flows, the lineage, all that can be structured, right, for specific purpose. However, before engaging in this kind of infrastructure development, the other two aspects of the work that I would say are critical to defining data enablement really are the standards that you are defining. So this means how well your organization understands, you know, what you need to measure. Let's say standard is the way you do your taxonomy. How do you organize the data you want to collect? How you tag it? How do you track information? This is very important. And usually we start building the architecture before understanding the taxonomy or the way we want to track information. And also what we want to measure. So if we don't really have a good structure and definition for the metrics or the measurements that we want to have in place, then definitely doing them after we have collected the data might not actually yield the results one would expect. It's actually much better to take a preventative approach in which we define what we need and then we build it, rather than build it with what we feel or believe might be important, right, afterwards. And the last piece that I would say on this aspect of data enablement, just recapping infrastructure, standards, and standards you can think of the taxonomy of tracking, defining metrics, building a set of operational definitions. And the last one is processes, right? That you can say call best practices or any other kind of collaboration that you want to establish, including communication with data teams, right? So this means what are the kind of flags that we put in place in order to have alerts when something fails in your data pipelines, right? What is the logic that we want to follow when establishing a data architecture, right? This needs to be understood by the technical teams working with infrastructure. And sometimes in many organizations I work, one of the biggest challenges is that data engineers were put to really bring context to business data. And to me, this feels very unusual because a data engineer should really focus on helping the organization process and organize that information rather than having to bring that context in. And that context should be a partnership with the analytics teams that are in closer contact with the people ultimately improving the business, right? Whether they are in product, operations, or any other capacity. And that's the type of communication process-wise that needs to be evolved and developed between the teams that are working on this technical data enablement piece.
Can you
so it comes down to first.
Can you just repeat that last part about perhaps the misconception of data engineering within organizations?
Yes. So again, this is based on my experience, might be different for many people in the audience. What I've observed ultimately is that the role of data engineers sometimes could be actually too open in scope. And sometimes in that openness, although it could be on purpose or maybe because the organization developed in that direction, data engineers are put to fill a gap of bringing business context and operational context to work that actually should not be their primary focus. And in that process, many things get lost because sometimes communicating back to leadership or to stakeholders that are not familiar with the technical aspects of data enablement could actually present many challenges. Just to give you a very simple one, right? When it comes to data collection, there is always a critical aspect of the work data engineers face when it comes to near real-time or real-time data. And of course, for people on the business side of things that are more used to this kind of passive reporting on business intelligence, right? Financials, operations, type of reporting, they might want to have real-time information, but it's actually not helpful, right? Because ultimately you really want to aggregate this data, curate it, and then present it perhaps monthly, weekly reporting in a weekly or monthly report, right? However, when it comes to product teams, they might benefit from real-time information. However, to really have this as a demand from the business directly to data engineers actually will present a lot of challenges because they won't be able to reconcile them. And most importantly, communication actually might be affected. So you will actually end up doing a lot more things less effectively. And also it will take away your attention from other areas that might be more important. This is just a tiny example, but it's something that perhaps the audience feels they have faced in the past when it comes to how fast you want to have that data presented, and also the challenges that come with having this near or real-time information in place.
Fantastic. I'm conscious of time and we've gone a little bit over. I wonder, for data leaders to get the impact in terms of the place of analytics as a decision-making discipline within product, what practical advice would you like to share with them?
So my advice to leaders in organizations that are less used to working with analysts, and specifically product leaders that might actually be just starting to get a sense of how data can really benefit their work and it can improve their decision making. My advice would actually be to really be open to incorporate a perspective from analytics into your strategy, vision, product vision, or even roadmap, right? If you want to make it a little bit more tactical. And that lens incorporation from analytics, it really means bringing an analytics leader or person within a team to the table, and just having, you know, them as part of your overall strategy setting, maybe for giving a different perspective or overall adding to what's already been discussed. That's essential. Just be open to having that person by your side at the table, right? And then a second advice I could give is to really be mindful that just because everybody talks about data doesn't necessarily mean that you have the skills yet, or that your organization is prepared for to use it. And that's a very important reflection and self-awareness piece that all leaders have to go through in order to be mindful that sometimes your organization might not be prepared, or you won't be prepared. Therefore, do get the people that are already ready to help you get there on board. And that's a very critical piece that I've seen many organizations failing to do, because they believe that just because they can do a few things on Excel, they can do them actually at a larger scale. And as I mentioned before, I work with data engineers, data scientists, data analysts, and my reflection is always, it's great that they have the technical skills, but sometimes they lack that bridge to talk to leaders. And it's the same with leaders. Leaders might be very excited about the data that they can make use of, but they just don't understand how complex the processes to get that data for what they need is. And that bridge is really the role of data leaders, and specifically within product, to really help that communication and overall aim to establish analytics as a discipline that an organization should embrace, right? And more specifically within product.
Fantastic. A decision-making discipline. And with the need, from what you've described today, of great vision, strategy, alignment, an understanding of how this will be executed, and then taking into account enablement and operationalization. Great advice and great conversation today. Really appreciate it, César. And I encourage anybody else, leader or individual contributor, who has questions about this very topic from a strategic or tactical point of view, you'd be the person to speak to.
Definitely. I look forward actually to getting many questions, and hopefully I can share a little bit more of my experience in the field. And I'm open as well to hearing your thoughts as to whether this framework or any other kind of experience that you had that could expand on my own experience can be helpful to see examples from your side as to what worked and what didn't. So I definitely, Joseph, thank you again for having me over, and did enjoy our conversation today.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thanks, César, and bye for now.